Hi, our presentation is on ethical decision making, a case of counselor burnout. Liberty University. This will be presented by Patrice Browning, Anna Connor, Matthew Kopp, Jennifer Masters, and Jonathan Milton. All right. For our group, we chose to go with scenario 1, which states Jan is a hardworking licensed professional counselor who has a very successful private practice. Jan has not had a vacation in over a year. She is feeling the stress and burnout and knows she needs to do something quickly for her own mental health. Thus, she decides to go on a vacation for a week. She quickly makes the arrangements and then emails all of her clients with whom she has appointments during the week of vacation, informing them of the need to cancel. She fails to let her other clients know she will be gone. Since none of her clients are in crisis, she decides to not worry about getting someone to cover her clients while she is gone. All right, and now for step 1. All right, so our presentation will be going over the 7 steps in the ethical decision-making model. For step 1, it's identifying the problem. The facts in scenario 1 states that Jan is experiencing stress, burnout, and impairment due to the lack of self-care. The definition of burnout is physical and emotional exhaustion involving the development of negative self-concept, negative job attitude, and loss of concern and feelings for clients. And this is Mullen 2017. Of course, Jan is experiencing burnout, but she is also experiencing stress. And stated in Ramley 2020, he says that stress can lead to distress, which can over time lead to burnout and impairment. And also, the medical professionals say impairment is described as the inability to deliver competent patient care. And this is what Jan is experiencing currently. She wants to go on vacation for a week for her mental health. This is due to Jan not practicing correct self care throughout the year. Jan's lack of planning the vacation in advance causes ethical issues. Jan does not follow ethical guidelines in making proper arrangements with other counselors or properly notifying all of her clients. And then she also emails clients with appointments during the vacation week to cancel. Jan neglects to allow the clients to make a choice in the matter of their appointments being canceled or providing other resources for other options due to her impairment. And then Jan also quickly makes a decision, or her quick decision may constitute abandonment and client neglect since she will be making quick decisions to go on a vacation and not notifying everybody that is needed to be notified. Now for step 2.
Okay, step 2, applying the ACO Code of Ethics. So the first violation we found was in section A.1.A, primary responsibility, and this states that the primary responsibility of counselors is to respect the dignity and promote the welfare of clients. This is from the ACO Code of Ethics of 2014, page 4. And Jane taking a short notice vacation route, having any backup plans for her clients, goes against promoting the welfare of her clients. The next violation is section A.4.A, avoiding harm. It states that counselors act to avoid harming their clients, trainees, and research participants, and to minimize or to remedy unavoidable or unanticipated harm. This is found on page 4. Now, Jane has the capacity to minimize harm by making the appropriate arrangements for her clients, but has failed to do so. And continuing with the ACO Code of Ethics, Section A.12, Abandonment and Client Neglect, discusses taking vacations and states counselors do not abandon or neglect clients in counseling. Counselors assist in making appropriate arrangements for the continuation of treatment when necessary during interruptions such as vacations, illnesses, and following terminations. This is also found on page 6. Jane has not followed the code of ethics as she hasn't made the appropriate arrangements when taking a vacation. So the good part is that Jane has recognized that she is starting to become impaired through burnout and stress, which is listed in section C.2.g, impairment. However, while she followed the recognition portion of this section, she did not seek assistance, as this section states they seek assistance for problems that reach the level of professional impairment. And that is on page 9. So, following the Nevada State Code of Ethics, we used this state because Patrice is located in it, and we found the most content in relation to the situation through their state codes. Um, NAC 641A.247, Responsibilities to Clients and Others, provides a guide on what to do in cases of withdrawal or interruption of services. In this case, her vacation. Jane's short notice vacation violates the following uh, subsection 9 and 10. Subsection 9 states a marriage and family therapist, clinical professional counselor, or intern shall not withdraw his or her counseling services precipitously except under unusual circumstances and after giving careful consideration to all factors in the situation and taking care to minimize possible adverse effects to the client. Subsection 10 states a marriage and family therapist, clinical professional counselor, or intern who anticipates the termination or interruption of service to a client shall notify the client as promptly as possible and seek the transfer, referral, or continuation of service in relation to the needs and preferences of the client. Continuing with the Nevada State Code of Ethics, NAC 641A.256, disciplinary action and professional conduct, interpreted acts constituting unprofessional conduct. 1. For the purposes of subsection 7 of NRS.641.310, the board will interpret the term unprofessional conduct to mean a lack of knowledge, skill, or ability in discharging a professional obligation and to include, without limitation, malpractice, and gross negligence. Gross negligence being defined as means conduct in the practice of marriage and family therapy or the practice of clinical professional counseling, which represents an extreme departure from the standard of care required from a marriage and family therapist, clinical professional counselor, or intern under the circumstances. Jane not providing the standard of care required of her as a licensed professional and abandoning her clients can be deemed as gross negligence. So on to step 3 with Anna.
Okay, so determining the nature and the dimensions of the dilemma. So in our reading and videos for this week, we had a lovely young man, from the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy. He had a very good nugget of information. He said it's okay to not know the answer. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're approaching any kind of dilemma, so that we approach it in a sense of being humbled and being able to learn, and the nuances of every single dilemma that comes to us, so that we are able to help determine specifically what needs to be done. So the very first rule in the association, the ACA, we have the primary responsibility, and that is to respect the dignity and promote the welfare of clients. So Jane was feeling burnt out. She hadn't had a vacation in a long time, and she needed time for herself. And she can't pour from an empty cup, so it's a good solution to go for herself and take care of herself. The ethical dilemmas are a problem for which no choice seems completely satisfactory, since there are good but contrary reasons to take conflicting and incompatible courses of action. Though she was in a state of burnout, she seemed to leave quickly. She left with no plan, it seemed, and she didn't really think of the clients in that moment. So I reached out as the instructions kind of suggested to some people. First, I reached out to my friend Andrea. She's been in this type field for 6 years. She's a licensed social worker, and she said there was different ethical principles that they went from, but she was able to break it down, and she was able to see that Jane did not stick to her obligations for the client. She didn't seem to have any kind of lifeline, if you will, for the client if there ever becomes a time of crisis for them. I also reached out to my state board and talked to Tracy through email and their investigator. So they were very law-minded about this. And so what they were breaking down was they had a lot of questions. They had questions about how if she is a private practice, solo practice, she needs to still have a social supervisor working with her to be able to sign off on diagnosis and treatment records. She also talked about how the clients need to be able to have some kind of contact, even as simple as a 911 redirect in case of some kind of crisis. And if she didn't have that, it could be a very serious thing for her and a clear violation of her care obligations. So, as the instructions talked about, it talked about how all of the ethical principles are very much important, but sometimes we have to prioritize them. And so we broke it down as a group, and we kind of came to the decision of these two, because she was not really thinking of the harm that possibly could happen, so no malice, or she wasn't doing, that was in violation, or fidelity. In the end, we kind of went with fidelity, because fidelity was, she was just forgetting all her responsibilities and wasn't taking care of the clients first. She was taking care of herself first. She was not honoring her commitments and her promises. So that's my part.
In addition to Anna's information, when referring to fidelity, Ramley 2020 states that counselors strive to be faithful to the promise they make. In our decision of choosing fidelity, we realize that Jen is not being faithful to her clients. Even though Jen is experiencing stress, burnout, and impairment, she still should remain faithful to her clients and handle her vacation properly by involving the clients in the process and seeking self-care for herself. Now for step 4.
Okay,
So for step 4, we were in the brainstorming phase, and we came up with 9 courses of action that encompassed a wide range of possibilities. At this point, we were not concerned about evaluating them to determine whether they were viable or not. And we gave each of them a title at the beginning in bold. And so for the first course of action, telecounseling, the course of action is Jane sends an email to clients to offer telecounseling if they are in crisis. The second course of action, monitoring. Jane asks her secretary to monitor her phone and email and refer clients as necessary. Shortened trip. Jane takes a 3-day weekend and plans for a longer vacation 2 or 3 months down the road. Ethical advice on trip. Jane speaks to a colleague or supervisor about how to ethically go on the trip. Informed consent. Jane does not go on vacation and instead revamps her informed consent form to handle this scenario in the future. Self-care mentoring. Jane does not go on vacation and instead speaks to a colleague or a supervisor about experiencing burnout and possibly being impaired. Self-care planning. Jane does not go on vacation and instead creates a new self-care plan. Ethics helplines. So Jane can contact the ACA or the Nevada Board of Clinical Professional Counseling before going on the trip. And arrangement. Jane waits to take the vacation until she can make proper arrangements with another counselor, either telecounseling or in person, to cover all of her clients. And so these were the 9 courses of action that we came up with. And so moving on to the next slide, we discuss step 5, which is the potential consequences for each of these courses of action. So for the first one, for telecounseling, just the clients that go into crisis, the potential consequences are Jane may not be capable of telecounseling. Will she be licensed in the state or country she's going to? Will she have a secure network? Does her informed consent form discuss telecounseling? Will this provide effective service? And so according to Kingsley and Henning, 2015, there may be some disagreement between clients and counselor on the efficacy of telecounseling if they haven't discussed it previously. So there may be, perhaps the clients would not find it to be an effective solution. For the second course of action for monitoring emails and phone calls by Jen's secretary, confidentiality does extend to Jane's associates and employees. However, the responsibility for keeping clients' information confidential does rely solely with Jane. However, her secretary does not have the professional qualifications to make referrals in her absence. For shortened trip, the 3-day weekend, a long weekend might provide temporary stress relief, but it will definitely not solve the underlying impairment that she's facing. For ethical advice on taking the trip, the colleagues and supervisors can help Jane with making the right decision on the trip. However, based on how fast Jane wants to leave, will she take the time to listen to them? And what if they bring up impairment? Is she going to listen to that? And now moving on, continuing step 5. For informed consent, where Jane does not go on the trip until her informed consent form is revamped. Revamping her consent form does not help Jane with her urgent self-care problem, but it does ensure that she ethically notifies the clients of trips in the future, addressing the issues of procedures and timeliness of putting out emails and letting them know. For self-care mentoring, where Jane talks to a colleague or supervisor about her impairment instead of going on the trip. Colleagues and supervisors can act as gatekeepers, and this may be just the guidance that she needs. But if she goes to them with her burnout symptoms, could she be putting her ability to practice in jeopardy? For self-care planning, where Jane creates a new self-care plan instead of going on a trip. Reevaluating her self-care plan will take time, and she's already feeling the stress and burnout from her job. And also, we thought, is she even competent enough at this point to make her own self-care plan? How can she assess her own state of burnout? For contacting the ACA and Nevada board helplines, ethic helplines, the Nevada board hotline is very responsive, but the ACA ethics consultation services does rank questions, and so they may not respond in a timely fashion. Jane could submit her self-care questions to them or her trip questions to them. And while they would make sure that she doesn't violate the ethical rules, they probably would not be able to help her in addressing her underlying burnout and impairment. And finally, for arrangement, where Jane makes appropriate arrangements with a colleague to help with her clients before taking the trip. Making an appropriate arrangement with another counselor does solve the abandonment issue. However, on its own, it does not deal with Jane's impairment, but it could be used in conjunction with another course of action that does. So continuing step 5, we have a table where we evaluated each course of action on whether it addressed our 2 main issues of abandonment and impairment. And as you can see for the first one, telecounseling clients, just the clients that are in crisis, we did not feel that that solved either the abandonment or the impairment issues. For her secretary monitoring emails and phone calls, we also did not feel that that solved either the abandonment or the impairment issues, and the secretary would not be professionally capable of providing referrals anyways. For the shortened trip, the 3-day weekend, we thought that that would solve the abandonment because she could just kind of push her schedule around a little bit and get like an extra day in there and so do a long weekend. And but we did say no for handling the impairment, with a little caveat there. You know, while it may provide some temporary relief, we've all gotten benefits from a 3-day weekend, but this isn't really going to be a long-term solution, but it may be useful if it's combined with another option. For the ethical advice on a trip, we said yes, it would handle abandonment if she followed the ethical advice on the trip that she got. She has to follow through, but it wouldn't handle the underlying impairment. For informed consent, where she doesn't go on the trip until she gets her informed consent form revamped, yes, it would solve the abandonment because she wouldn't go on the trip, but it would not solve the impairment. For the self-care mentoring, where Jane talks to a colleague or supervisor about her impairment instead of going on the trip, yes, it does solve the abandonment issue, and because she doesn't go on the trip. And then yes, it solves the impairment issue, but only if she follows through on the guidance that comes from her colleague or supervisor. For self-care planning, where Jane creates a new self-care plan instead of going on a trip, it again, she doesn't go on the trip, so it solves the abandonment issue. But for impairment, it just may be too late for her to address this issue on her own. For contacting the ACA or Nevada board helplines, again, yes, on the abandonment, if she follows through on their guidance, but no on the impairment. And then finally, for the arrangement where Jane makes an appropriate arrangement with a colleague before taking the trip to help out with all of her clients. So yes, that would solve the abandonment issue. But no, it wouldn't directly address the impairment issue. However, we did think that if we used it in conjunction with another option, then it could be a part of a viable solution. And now on for step 6.
Okay, for step 6, evaluate the selected course of action. We created a chart so we could evaluate the 4 potential options for Jane. So we created the chart to see if our recommended actions would pass the simple 3 tests of justice, a sense of fairness in treating everyone the same, publicity, being okay if the actions went public, universality, recommending the same action for another counselor in the same situation. And after we evaluated all 4 of them, we felt that they all passed the test. So now on to step 7. After we carefully evaluated all the potential actions and the potential consequences of those actions, we feel confident in recommending a multiple step process to combat Jane's feelings of stress and burnout. The 4 actions that we recommend is starting with that shortened trip. As Anna said, you can't pour from an empty glass. So hopefully by taking this shortened trip, a 3-day weekend, it'll offer Jane some time to relax, maybe get some mental clarity, refill that jug a little bit, so when she comes back, she's a bit refreshed.
We also recommend the self-care mentoring. We hope that she made arrangements before she left to meet with a competent professional once she returns. She also will need to reevaluate her self-care planning. We would recommend that she seeks assistance with bettering a wellness plan. A good wellness plan should consist of 6 aspects. It should consist of intellectual, emotional, physical, occupational, social, and spiritual. Then arrangements for a counselor to cover her clients for a longer vacation in the future. We do feel that Jane would benefit from taking a good long week or so vacation somewhere 2 or 3 months down the road. However, this time around, she should make arrangements for another counselor to handle her clients while she's away. According to Hendricks et al. 2009, counselors have a responsibility to pursue successful self-care strategies so that stress and anxiety become more self-controlled. We don't feel that Jane has done a very good job at being successful with her self-care plan. Step 7, continuing. So in our chart that we have here, we feel that Jane needs to keep current on the counseling wellness competencies. Step 4, stress, burnout, and impairment, we feel applies to Jane and her wellness plan. Step 5, the professional support practices, we feel that supports Jane's need for mentorship. And now on to our reference page. This is our reference page, and it concludes our group presentation.